and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. I've been doing this podcast for about a little over 4.5 years now, and there's one subject I've deliberately stayed away from: politics. Not because I don't think politics matters. Of course it does. It's, how we shape our lives. I avoided this subject because, well, I never really saw someone's political beliefs and how they needed to be of some sort of importance or matter when it came to kink. Who you vote for, who you want representing you, or what you believe the role of government should be has very little to do with what you and I might negotiate in a private setting. Now, if we're talking about a scene, I'm much more interested in boundaries and consent and experience and so on and so forth, right? I'm less interested in anything else. And it does really start to shape a lot of the things now in the most updated sphere that we're in, where these things are starting to affect families, friends, relationships, marriages, whatever. Over the last several years, I've watched those worlds between politics and kink become increasingly fused. We hear phrases like kink is political, sex is political, and they're repeated as that there's some sort of interchangeable topic or that they're universally true. They're not even the same thing. Kink can be sexual, but kink and sex aren't synonymous. And while politics has absolutely affected kink throughout history, it still leaves us with a question that I don't think we asked often enough here. Does kink have any political history, or does kink having a political history mean kink itself is inherently political? It's an interesting question. Now, before we get into all of that, I still, I'm going to do what I do every week. I want to thank all of you who are tuning in, listening, who share the show, who find my voice a little bit annoying. Thank you, Quebec. I believe you're in Quebec, up in Canada. Got that nice message from. A couple of the new listeners from Belgrade and Moscow who reached out to say hello. I hear all of you, right? Thank you for finding the show, listening. I'm glad it gives you something and spending some of your time with me here. Do me a favor. If you follow the show, you're listening on Spotify and you're on the app, go to the 3 little dots, rate the show 5 stars. This allows other people to find the show, keeps the show growing. It allows, you can share the show that way. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe, let you know when a new show drops. On Apple, do me the same thing. So one favor I do ask, rate the show 5 stars. It keeps it growing, right? 4.5 years, I've kept the show free for you all. Right? It's a little thing that I'm asking. If you do want to support the show, there is a link in the show's description. Every little bit helps the show bring these discussions to you. All right, let's get back to this. This is currently part, I think, 5 of a 6 or 7 show arc that I've been on. But I'm not interested today in spending this episode telling you how to vote. I'm certainly not going to tell you which political belief you're supposed to have. I want to understand what happens when our political identity begins to determine who we believe belongs here in the first place. Because kink has always brought together people who have a very little in common from the outside. And the moment we cross the threshold of a dungeon or a play space or an event, we become more united. So the harder question is today, what happens to a community built around accepting difference when political difference becomes the one difference we can no longer tolerate? And maybe that's where we need to begin today. Maybe that question, or maybe the question isn't really whether kink is political. Maybe it's what politics is doing to us. So I want to start here. What do I mean when we say kink is political? Let's start with that phrase itself, because if we're going to do this conversation, I think we need to understand what we're actually talking about. Kink is political because we see it. We see it in writings. almost every day or every couple, at least once a week, right? I've heard some version of that statement for years. Doesn't matter when or who says it. And if we're going to be as a matter of fact, kink is sometimes political. Sometimes sex is political. Other times the argument is that BDSM itself is rooted in politics because it deals with power and identity and consent and social structures. There are variations, but they often seem to arrive at the same conclusion. Politics and kink cannot really be separated. There are parts of that argument I don't have much difficulty with. Kink doesn't exist in some separate world where everything happening around us suddenly disappears. Laws can affect what we do. BDSM has a long history of stigma and psychiatric classification, right? Ongoing research continues to evolve with people involved in BDSM, right? Even a 2022 review of kink research discusses how marginalization and minority stress alongside the biological and psychological dimensions of kink works, right? That matters because it tells us something important about how people experience kink within the larger society around them. There is also research looking at BDSM through political and social frameworks. People are looking into this, right? There are people for whom kink is connected to liberation and resistance and identity or even activism. I have no interest in telling any of those people that they're wrong or what their kink means to them. Because every kink journey is a separate one. Everybody's kink journey is a separate one. Where I start having a difficulty in all of this is when we take all of that and make a much larger statement about everybody else. Because I think we're actually talking about three different things. Kink has been affected by politics, it can have a political meaning. And finally, there is the claim that kink is inherently political. Those statements may sound similar, but they're not saying the same thing. Something can be affected by politics without the activity itself becoming political. Nearly everything we do exists within laws and social expectations and cultural norms. That doesn't automatically tell us why an individual participates it participates in it or what the experience means to them. And the same problem comes up when we talk about identity. Race might affect someone's experience within BDSM or their orientation, or, you know, someone else might understand their kink as part of a larger struggle around their sexual freedom. Those are real experiences, and there is scholarship in examining them. But what happens when we take one person's meaning and turn it into everybody's definition? That's going to become the more interesting question here. Now, let's say two people enjoy the same kind of power exchange. For one of them, the experience is deeply connected to the identity and, their liberation. They may genuinely consider what they're doing is political. The other person may just be there because they're enjoying giving up control to someone they trust or receiving that control. There doesn't have to be a political statement underneath it. So why would either person get to decide what the experience means for the other person? I think that's where this conversation starts getting complicated. Even the research itself doesn't give us one simple explanation for kink. The biopsychosocial literature looks at everything from sensation seeking to the psychological altered states to social identity and growth and relationships and all these things. That's quite a different place from saying researchers have discovered that kink is fundamentally a political behavior. And maybe that's part of the problem with the phrase itself. When we say kink is political, we can be talking about the way governments and institutions have responded to kink. We might be talking about the activists fighting stigma or seeking recognition. Someone may be describing their own experience of kink through their race or gender or sexuality or some other part of their identity. All of those conversations can involve politics, but none of them necessarily establishes that politics is what kink means for everyone participating in it. I've spent a lot of years around this community, going on near 3 decades. And one thing I've learned is that people arrive here for very different reasons. They try to find a single explanation for why someone is kinky, you know, has never worked out particularly well. I'm not sure politics suddenly gives us one. I don't think the question is whether politics has ever touched kink. Clearly, it really has. And nor am I questioning whether kink can carry political meaning for some people. We've already established that it can. What I am less convinced of is the leap from can to must. Because once we decide that kink is inherently political, another question follows pretty quickly. When did somebody else's political interpretation of kink become something the rest of us were expected to follow? And I think that's a really powerful question. And I'm going to get to why I'm asking that a little later on. It's a big question. Because then we're getting into what we all need to follow. So let's talk about, sorry, I'm drinking some coffee today, trying to keep my caffeine up. I want to talk about now when everything becomes political, because this is something else that I normally see. One of the things I've noticed over the past several years is how quickly a political label can become shorthand for an entire person. We hear that somebody is a conservative, progressive, Republican, Democrat, national, labor, Tory, doesn't matter, socialist, communist, MAGA, Trump supporter, Biden supporter, doesn't really matter. Pick who you want. Trudeau, doesn't matter what political leader. And suddenly we think we know considerably more about them than they have actually told us. Their politics become a shortcut to their character. And that's where I start getting uncomfortable. Political beliefs can tell us something about a person. I'm not suggesting otherwise. What someone supports may reflect their values, priorities, or how they think a government should operate. But there's a pretty significant distance between knowing someone, something about someone and believing you know everything necessary to judge them. And once we cross that distance, curiosity totally disappears. Instead of asking someone what they believe, we tell ourselves we already know. And we begin assigning motives and values based on political category that we've put them in. And eventually, we no longer are responding to the person who's standing in front of us. We're responding to everything the label has represented to us. Now, this is where kink is an interesting place for that to happen. This is about, I want you to think about how much difference we already accept within this community. When I joined, people had different sexual orientations. They have relationship structures, religious beliefs, gender identities, fetishes, dynamics, limits, right? Stuff they want to explore. You can walk into a dungeon and find people doing things you would never personally want to do. And most of the time, the answer is pretty simple. Don't do it. We don't usually require everyone in the room to want what we want before we're willing to share the room with them. Yet somehow, politics can be different. Now, about a year ago, I spoke about this in the past. I experienced this firsthand. I went with a group of people to attend a demo at a dungeon. We were super excited. And I don't know, there was a big group of us. It was like somewhere between 12 and 14 of us. We weren't there for a political event. We weren't there. We were not campaigning. None of us were talking politics. That was like the last thing from our mind. We were there because somebody was going to give a demo we wanted to see. We were happy to pay for it. And at $50 a person, you better be happy, and it better be a darn good demo. However, when we arrived, one of the questions we were asked at the door, straight off the bat, was who we voted for. I was confused. I sat back for a second and I said, first thing I said is, I'm sorry, I must have misunderstood you. They asked me again, and I said, well, I refused to answer. I said, not because I'm embarrassed by my vote or because I was trying to hide anything, simply I didn't believe it was any of their business. I was here for a demo. How I vote privately has nothing to do whether I could sit in that room or behave or respect the rules of the room. All I wanted to do is watch somebody demonstrate an activity of something I was enjoying or I wanted to enjoy or learn about. So they wouldn't let us in. I said, okay. So all 14 of us left. Now, I knew the person who owned this place, so I contacted them privately. I explained why we won't be returning and that our group will never come back. Now, for me, the issue wasn't that somebody at the door had a different political belief than I did. I don't care about that. I didn't want to know, even if I had a guess. The problem was that political disclosure had become part of the determining whether we were acceptable enough to enter the kink space. That's a very different thing. Now, a dungeon has absolutely the right to establish standards of conduct. I expect it to. All of us do. If somebody violates consent or ignores boundaries or harasses other people or refuses to follow the rules of the space, deal with the behavior. That's part of maintaining a functioning community. But asking who someone voted for isn't evaluating their behavior. You're asking for a political identity and then deciding what that answer tells you about the person before they've done anything. And I think we need to be careful about where that leads. Now, nobody owes anyone access to their body or scene or relationship or what have you. If you don't want to play with somebody because of their politics, then don't play with them. That's fine. You don't need my permission or anyone else's justification for making that choice. But choosing who you personally want to engage with is different from deciding who should be allowed to belong. And that's the distinction I think we're starting to lose. Because once agreement becomes a condition of belonging, we're no longer simply talking about personal compatibility. We've created another standard people have to satisfy before they're accepted into a community that has spent decades asking the outside world not to judge us by labels before getting to know who we actually are. And then that's going to leave us with a much harder question. If someone's politics cross a moral or ethical line for you, does that give you the right to decide they shouldn't belong here at all? It's a big question. And I have spent hours thinking about these questions. I have spent months. I've been working on this show for 4 months. I've been sitting with all these questions and I don't know how to answer them. But I think this is why we're talking about it today. And this is going to bring me to my next point, the cost of political certainty. There is a fair challenge to everything I've said so far. I think we need to deal with it. What happens when somebody's politics aren't simply about taxes or government spending or foreign policy? What if their political beliefs represent something you consider morally or ethically wrong? Well, I don't think we can dismiss that. Politics can absolutely represent and reflect our values. There are political positions that may tell you something important about whether you're compatible with another person. If someone expresses a belief that fundamentally conflicts with something you value, you're allowed to take that seriously. Nothing about accepting difference requires you to become friends with everyone you meet. And it certainly doesn't require you to enter a scene or a relationship with someone that you don't trust. The problem begins when knowing one thing about someone convinces us that we know everything. As human beings, we categorize. There is far too much information coming at us from, every day to carefully investigate everything from the beginning. So categories here help us make sense of people and situations very quickly. The difficulty is that useful shortcut can become a conclusion before we realize we've made one. Politics gives us some particularly powerful categories, right? So let's get into that one. Once I've decided what a Republican, Democrat, conservative, socialist, communist, MAGA, or any other political identity means, I can start filling in information the person's never actually given me. I may assume how they feel about a particular group or what kind of moral character they have. Then guess what? I start noticing that support the the things that support what I already believe about that group while giving less attention to anything that complicates my assumptions. The person standing in front of me becomes less important than the category I've already put them into. There is an emotional cost to being on the receiving end of that, especially when it happens repeatedly. Imagine finding a community where you finally feel comfortable enough to express your eroticism and desires and your fantasies that you keep private from everywhere else, only to discover there's another part of you that needs to remain hidden if you want to continue belonging. And guess what? I talked about this last week when I covered religion, right? Now, at first, maybe you simply stop mentioning your politics. Now, over time, you might start paying closer attention to every conversation before deciding whether it's safe to participate. And you begin wondering what's going to happen if people find out what you believe. That changes the way you relate to people around you. Instead of simply getting to know someone, part of your attention is now now focused on whether being honest will change how they treat you. Trust becomes harder because acceptance begins to feel conditional. You might still be welcome, but only as long as certain parts of you remain out of sight. Now, for some people, that creates sadness or rejection. For others, it's anger and defensiveness. Eventually, somebody who repeatedly experiences that may decide the community isn't worth the emotional cost and they just simply leave. And there's another problem that can develop from there. Someone who feels rejected may become defensive and angry or even respond harshly. The person on the other side sees that reaction and thinks, well, guess what? That's exactly like I said who they were. So the original assumption now is confirmed. The person who was rejected experiences even more hostility and becomes more entrenched in their own position. And then the battle just goes back and forth. And both people, you know, walk away from that same interaction believing the other person just proved them right. And that's how these divisions can become increasingly difficult to interrupt. There's also something that happens when political disagreement becomes a moral judgment. If I genuinely believe your politics make you a bad person, curiosity itself can start to feel wrong. Listening to you may feel like I'm legitimizing something I find unacceptable. So, compromise, that becomes complicated, and I'm probably not going to. And then at that point, exclusion doesn't necessarily feel intolerant, it's going to feel righteous. We're experiencing that already. I may genuinely believe I'm protecting the people around me. The stronger that certainty becomes, the easier it is to stop questioning whether I'm responding to someone's actual behavior or what I believe their politics predict about them. That's an uncomfortable distinction because kink should understand it's better than most communities. Think about what BDSM looks like without context. An outsider can see someone that's being restrained or engaging in some impact play, and they're going to come to a completely different conclusion about what's happening. We tell people all the time that you can't understand BDSM simply by looking at the behavior. You need to understand the consent and the community, the education, the boundaries, the trust, all of it. You have to understand what the experience means to that person. So context changes what you're looking at. Yet, when it comes to politics and that walks in the room, we can abandon the same principle remarkably quick. We see one identifier and decide we have enough information to understand the person attached to it. Maybe we don't. None of this means political beliefs are irrelevant. It doesn't mean genuinely harmful behavior should be excused in the name of tolerance. If someone behaves badly in a kink space, address it. To violate the consent or harass somebody, there should be consequences for that behavior. But there's a difference between responding to something someone has done and deciding what they're likely to do because of what we believe about them. And I think that's where political certainty can become dangerous inside of a community. Because once we stop separating the individual from the category, exclusion becomes a really easy step to justify. And from exclusion, we enter groupthink. And that means if you're then inside that group, you have to stay in their thought process. Originality will die out. And we can convince ourselves that we're protecting acceptance by deciding which kinds of people are no longer worthy of receiving it. And that leaves me wondering where the boundary actually belongs. At what point does protecting a community from genuinely harmful behavior become protecting it from people whose beliefs we've already decided make them harmful? That's a really another interesting question. And that question popped up to me a few weeks ago. Let me explain why. A couple of weeks ago, I don't know, I think I talked about it on the show when I did Context Matters, which was the second show in this arc. And I talked about specifically uh, understanding that because that question was arisen, that came to me because it started with the whole, I look at it as virtue signaling, writing a post about certain groups doing better or certain genders doing better. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't change behavior. I can't make people change their behavior unless they want to. I also realize when I come online or I do and I interact with social media, there are going to be bad faith actors. And it's unfortunate. But thank God I've got tools at my disposal. I also understand that if I post something, I might engage with the bad faith actor. It happened yesterday. So I exercised my right. I just blocked them. I'm not going to get into that person. There was a whole thing, right? That's not what this show is about. However, if we are looking to have things done, because the conversation from a few weeks ago then led to something that it leads to two other things. People don't agree, that's fine. But now we're telling us who can enter what spaces, who's allowed to say what. If you don't, you're part of the problem. First off, I don't do virtue signaling. Doesn't help. Doesn't change behavior. And to the person who did that, if you're still in the profession, should realize that. It's not because I'm dogging you and I didn't want to not do it, but because I asked a legitimate question. What will me writing a virtue signaling post do to change behavior? A few days ago, well, this past week, I did call out very predatory behavior of a male and female dominant and how they were using psychological manipulation and coercive control. Now, that to me was much more valuable, right? But virtue signaling and all that stuff, it doesn't work. But again, I got judged on something because I was categorized. This time it was because of gender. That's okay. I'm fine with it. Doesn't bother me, right? But we're doing this, we're making these assumptions. We are making these assumptions about people before we get to know them. We don't know them. It's why a lot of times when people ask me, well, why don't you talk about yourself? Well, I've kind of covered why I don't. I want to keep this about the work. Second, I don't like talking about myself. And third, I don't like letting people in, and that's okay. Not there's particular reasons for it, but that's fine, and I'm allowed to have my own, and I don't need to discuss them. Right? We all have our own reasons. But we start assigning groups, we start assigning notions to people, and that's it. Well, what kind of world do you want to live in where it's your rule only? And I don't care what side you're on. We move out of anything that looks like we have all the ability to at least a chance to have our voice being heard through the voting process, and we move into authoritarian rule or groupthink, and that's not a world, or at least a country I want to live in, right? And I know that statement right there alone is probably going to incite a lot of people. But ask yourself, why is your view, and I don't care where you are at on that political spectrum, but how come your view is the only one that's allowed to exist? And what would the world look like? Not fantasy, in reality. I'm a student of history. There's a lot of things a lot of you don't know about me, right? I have there's something I used to do in a prior career. What I'm saying is I'm very well versed. Read. I implore you. Get involved. Go vote. Do what you want to do. That's all great, right? But just recognize some of the things that are going to happen. All right, let's get back to track on this. Does kink still make room for the difference? For all the problems kink communities have had over the years, one of the things I've always found interesting about them is how different the people inside of them can be. Put a group of kinky people together in the same room, and there may be, you know, very little else connecting them except kink. Different professions, religions, their sexual orientation, relationship structures, backgrounds, generations, life experiences, they can all occupy the same space. Some of those people probably wouldn't have, you wouldn't have met them anywhere else. Others, you might even have very little reason to speak to them outside of kink. That doesn't mean these communities have always been accepting. They haven't. Kink has had its own problems with discrimination and exclusion and gatekeeping and prejudice over the years. And pretending otherwise would romanticize a history that was never that simple. But difference has always been in the room. And maybe that's why I think this particular conversation matters. If we're going to say that kink makes room for people who are different from us, we eventually have to decide what we actually mean by difference. It's relatively easy to accept differences we don't find threatening. The harder test comes when we encounter something we genuinely dislike or disagree with, or simply just don't even understand. There are limits to that, and there should be. Making room for difference doesn't mean overlooking somebody's behavior. If somebody violates consent, or if they're harassing or threatening someone, or hate or racism or whatever, then we need to deal with what they've done. A community doesn't become more accepting by refusing to protect the people inside of it, but behavior gives us something tangible to respond to. Political identity is more complicated because we're often responding to what we believe that identity tells us someone might believe or support or even eventually do. And if no political agreement starts becoming another condition, you know, or if political agreement starts becoming another condition of belonging, I think we need to we need to ask the bigger question, what the community loses in that exchange. Some people are going to leave. Others might stay and learn what subjects are better left alone. And over time, that range of people, willing to participate will probably become narrower. Not necessarily because everybody suddenly agrees, but because disagreement has become increasingly expensive to express. And that's going to change a community. You hear fewer perspectives that challenge your assumptions, and people become less willing to ask questions that they aren't sure how those questions might be received. And eventually, it can become very easy to look around you at the people who remain and conclude that almost everyone agrees with you. Maybe they do, or maybe the people don't, who don't have simply learned not to tell you a damn thing. And there's another distinction here that I think that has gotten lost in some of these conversations. Making room for somebody is not the same as endorsing them. Sharing a dungeons with somebody doesn't mean you approve of their politics or anything else. Attending the same event doesn't mean you're supporting a candidate. And existing in the same online community doesn't require either of you, to validate what the other believes. Tolerance was never supposed to mean agreement. And belonging to the same larger community doesn't entitle anyone to personal access either. You don't owe somebody a scene because they're kinky. You don't owe them friendship or a relationship, even a conversation. If someone's political beliefs make them incompatible with you personally, you're allowed to make that decision. That's a boundary. But there is a difference between saying, I don't want this person in my life, and saying, people like this shouldn't be part of our community. The first tells me something about where you've drawn your personal boundary. The second starts drawing that boundary for everybody else. And maybe that's where we need to be particularly careful. Kink has spent a very long time asking people outside of this community not to decide who we were based on one thing they know about us. We asked them not to see the fetish and assume pathology. We asked them not to look at power exchange and assume that we're being abusive. And we fought against the idea that one part of someone's sexuality tells you everything you need to judge the person attached to it. That doesn't mean political beliefs and kink interests are equivalent. They're not. But the habit of reducing a complicated human being to a single characteristic should at least feel familiar to us. And maybe making room for difference doesn't require anyone to surrender their convictions. It doesn't require political science. It certainly doesn't require pretending that every belief is harmless. Perhaps it asks us something considerably smaller. Can I leave enough room between learning one thing about you and deciding I know everything else? Because if we lose that ability, I don't know that politics has made kink safer or more accepting or definitely even more inclusive. It may have simply given us another reason to decide who doesn't belong. And after everything we've talked about today, I think that's where I land. Can we still encounter somebody as a person before deciding what their politics tell us they must be? So finally, what are we protecting? And I don't know if there is one answer to any of this. And maybe there shouldn't be. I'm not interested in telling anybody where they should draw their political boundaries. Some disagreements matter, some may matter enough you decide you don't want somebody in your life or relationship or family or anywhere near your play. You get to make that choice for yourself. But disagreement and dehumanization don't need to become synonymous. Maybe the value of having this conversation isn't figuring out everybody's politics. Maybe it's allowing us not to have to. When I walk into a kink space, I'm not interested in who you voted for. I'm not asking you who you pray with, sleep with, what you drive, or what you have for dinner. I'm interested in what brought you in that room with me. That's what I want to hear about. I want to hear about your journey. That's the stuff that gets me excited. What brought you into this wonderful lifestyle that has a very long history, thousands of years of history in varied forms, right? That's the part that still excites me after all of these years. I want to talk about the scene. I want to know what you're into, your boundaries, all of that stuff, right? Except for the rope community, because you all know how I feel about you, right? A little bit of levity. We need it, right? Let's talk about impact and power exchange and psych play, all of those things. That's why I'm here. None of that requires us to pretend the world outside that door or that room doesn't exist. Politics and religion and identity matter, and there are times when those things absolutely need to be discussed. I just don't know that they need to determine every interaction we have with another human being. Maybe we can disagree and still share the room. Maybe we can have strong convictions without requiring everyone around us to hold the same ones. And when somebody does actually cross the line, perhaps we can judge them by the line they've actually crossed rather than the one we assumed they eventually would. I didn't start today's show believing I could settle whether kink is political, and I'm certainly not ending it believing I've solved what politics is doing to kink. But I do think we're capable of asking ourselves one final question. If kink taught us that people are more complicated than labels society gives them, when did we stop extending the same courtesy to each other? And I think that's the biggest question I have for everybody. I think that's the biggest question we all need to be looking at. I don't think I'm going to change a lot of minds. My goal in doing this was I'm hoping this gives everybody something to start thinking about. And I don't even have to get to the point where this is online yet while I'm still talking about the show, and I already hear the arguments in my head, and it saddens me. You're this, you're that. You voted for this person and that man, that woman, doesn't matter. That's it. We've just decided. And what's shameful for me is there are people I would love to interact with or talk to or learn from. new things. And I can't because those choices get made. And that's fine. I'll respect it. But then we look at all these opportunities lost. It's why I think a lot of people have, I don't know, there is a strong majority I talk to globally, Canada, different parts of the US, different countries in Europe. They're starting to go back to where you had to be vetted and real BDSM is going on in private settings because they want away from all of this. I don't even know if that's the answer. And I'm not saying it should be, because another thing that I loved about Kink so much, it was that shared space of watching someone get a needle corset while somebody was on a St. Andrew's cross doing electric play, while somebody in the corner was doing golden showers, right? And that happened at a dungeon I was at, and that wasn't even like all of it. And it was such a sensory overload for me that night. My eyes were going everywhere, and I just enjoyed it. And the costumes and the leather and the latex and the smells and all of it. All of it. I don't want to lose that. Maybe that's something else we have to consider. It's a lot here today. I'm under no assumptions that I'm remotely solving this debate, but I do understand the emotional side. I understand what the behaviors are doing to a lot of us. A lot of us. I'm going to leave you with my question again today. I'm not going to talk about anything else. I'm going to talk about one thing. So I had because I had a stressful week last week. My gosh, I think it was actually by accident. I had left my wallet in the car, but I went to go to the puppy place again. And had I had my wallet, I was walking out with the dog. Charity wise, I'd like to see, hear what you guys are doing. If we as a kink community, you look at it as a gigantic global fraternity or sorority or whatever, how do we give back to the world around us too? Right? I'm not talking about getting up and dress and then going, doing whatever, but soup kitchens, donating food, homeless shelters, whatever, right? If you want the world to be a better place, you can't just expect everybody else to do it, right? Pay it forward. I am. I'm just watching my time. I think my new rule is now when I go and play at the animal shelter and I buy all those lovely people lunches and I get them food for the animals, I leave my wallet in the car because otherwise I'm walking out with the dog. And I can't. Everybody's like, why? Because I can't. Right? There's a little chocolate lab that I just adore, but I can't take her home. Anyway, digressing a little bit because I need to calm down from this. Because even talking about this is charged for me. And I understand the impact on everybody. Right? I've been around for 52 years, right? Growing up inside of the U.S. political system, and now growing up, now I'm spending I've spent a plus decade in other systems, other political systems, and I watch all the same. The division is still there. It doesn't really matter. You're bad. You're dumb. All these things. We just have different views, right? I know it's a lot to think about. I don't even know if I even got to the core of this. I just don't know. I hope I did. I hope I gave you all something to seriously start considering, right? I know there's a lot of you who listen and a lot of you who comment to me privately. I don't judge. Do what's best for you, right? But respect and moving forward, right? So here's the question again before I get out of here. If Kink taught us that people are more complicated than the beliefs society gives them, when did we stop extending that same courtesy to each other? Until next time, everybody, be safe and stay kinky.